Hello, Abigail here with the astrology of this week. This week, we are continuing to have kind of the play out of this explosive energy we've been experiencing. It's also really important to note that when we're talking about astrology and aspects, yes, there are these kind of like points and climaxes that we experience when things go exact, but also they're continuing to play out in the sky, even when we're not really paying attention to them. So, Mars is still in the orb of Pluto. It's in the orb of the sun. Venus and Mercury are slowly getting out of orb of the sun. Mercury will officially get into Pisces, and for me, that's a barrier where it will no longer be um, as affected by the sun. And so we're really seeing some stuff play out from last week, especially when it comes to Mars things and kind of the explosive nature. Also, we're adding in an extra player. We're adding our friend Uranus because we start off this week with Uranus stationing direct for the last time in Taurus. Uranus has an 84-year cycle. So if you're alive right now, not a small child, it is very likely that you will never, unless something drastically changes in our world, that you will never see Uranus and Taurus again. So we're not quite to its final ingress into Gemini, which will happen on, I believe, April 25th. But this is kind of that beginning of the end that we were experiencing with Neptune, that we are currently experiencing with our friend Saturn at 29 degrees of Pisces. And so things are going to start to progress. Also, with Uranus direct, I do think we're going to start to see some form of actual change. Now, with astrology, it remains to be seen what kind of change. I think we're going to get a mixed bag. I think we're going to see some stuff that's progressive. And I also think we're going to see some stuff that is an escalation of issues we've been seeing, especially when it comes to things like AI and the environment. I saw a weather report that we're looking at another polar vortex in February, and it's going to extend later into spring than normal because of global warming. We've destabilized that little area of polar air that is nicely up around the North Pole. And now it's being really wiggly and coming down into places and making them colder and causing people who don't understand how that works to scream that that global warming isn't real because it's not hot. And that's not how it works, folks. I'm not an expert, but I do know that. So we're going to start to see that. I do think that final Uranus and Taurus is us experiencing this really extreme cold, and Taurus is about the body, it is about the land. Important to note with Neptune where it is, and with Uranus going into Gemini, we are looking at some tough years ahead for the environment, some tough years ahead for trying to pull back and save. The planet will heal if we ever disappear from it, but to save ourselves from our own destruction, because we're moving very quickly towards running ourselves. And I shouldn't say our. The billionaires are running us out of resources because they're hoarding them and then demanding more, 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 more. And so with Uranus stationing direct, we are going to see that coming to the forefront. I think it's also important as we head towards Gemini to really start to make these connections, if we haven't already, how everything is interconnected. Gemini is all about how all of these synapses and connections all bounce off of each other. Gemini is a very interconnected sign, as an air sign, as being ruled by Mercury, and we're not there yet, but this moment is a part of that bigger journey of us heading into Gemini in April. And so this is the time to, consider your use of AI if you use it. I personally don't as much as possible. Obviously, they slip it in everything to become conscious of water use. Not as in like denying yourself a lot, but watching where the water is going. Neptune and Aries, there's going to be a lot of issues with water lack. And we're going to start to see the effects with the Saturn conjunction and Saturn and Aries for the next two years. So keep in mind that all of these things are super deeply interconnected and really intense. Sorry, I've got a frog in my throat. Very deeply interconnected when we see these big stations. And when I say station, this is the moment it stations direct, because it is such a far outer body. It will take several days to a week to start to inch forward. It takes a while. So we're going to be sitting in this kind of stuck Uranian moment. I also think it is going to force people to grapple with change, to grapple with, you know, new ideology. Uranus doesn't necessarily rule ideology completely. There's kind of a conversation between a lot of different planets, but it does rule newness and freshness and ideas and progression. And so that's what we're dealing with. And as this happens on Thursday, and this starts off on Uranus stations direct starts on, I didn't put my notes, what day would that be? Wednesday. The day after, while it's still stationed and still kind of in the sky, readjusting itself, Mercury goes into its square. And this will be the final square with Mercury because by the time we get to April, Mercury will not be on the other side of the zodiac. So this is that last moment. It highlights deeply where we are when it comes to progress, where we are when it comes to who is progressing and who is being left behind. It is really going to bring to the forefront, and I think even people who have been bootlicking, I do think we're going to start to see a bit of a shift as they start to slowly. Not everyone. There's some people who are not gonna not gonna stop that. Um, but I do think we're going to see people who are kind of in the middle starting to recognize that there's some resource lack, and that resource lack isn't necessarily because of their neighbor. And being like, oh, I've been okay and cool with really rich people taking stuff because it hasn't affected me, but they're starting to see that it's going to. And yeah, it's a very self-centered position, but unfortunately not everyone is ruled by morals and ethics. Many people are ruled by desire and what they consider prosperous for themselves, and that's going to be highlighted. I do think for some of us it's going to force us to, if we haven't already, especially with these eclipses up and coming, going to force us to kind of face off with family and face off with friends who are kind of waffling, or this also can happen, digging their heels in and refusing to see what's going on purpose, and having these conversations about, hey, things are getting completely wrecked. They've always been completely wrecked, but now it's getting to a completely wrecked point that even you can't ignore. And like, how can we have a relationship if you don't care? I'm disabled. A lot of things affect me deeply that might not affect not disabled, an able-bodied person. So I'm having conversations around being like, you know, you continue to refuse to engage in politics. Um, but my existence is political as a queer person, as a disabled person. And no, I want to make clear I'm not the most marginalized. And I do have privileges based on the fact that while seated, if I don't have my cane, no one can tell that I'm disabled, except narcissists. They somehow flag that I'm autistic. LOL. So, just having these conversations with people, with being like, this is how things are, this is where things are going, this is how quickly things are changing, this is how innovations or shifts are really affecting um, me, my community. When are you going to participate? Because if you're not, it's going to be really hard for us to for us to continue this relationship, this communication, this connection, very mercurial. And while we do have one more thing I want to talk about before we get there, we have the Venus square Uranus on Sunday as well. So these conversations are going to be immediately touched off by Venus by the end of the week. This is also the time to kind of, yeah, Venus square Uranus is being honest about where we are and about what needs to happen, and not what needs to happen as in like what is functionally possible, because we've kind of pushed ourselves past that point. We need change so drastic that it is going to smash a lot of things down. But like, what do we have to do, whether we know how to get there or not, in order to honor the land, in order to honor indigeneity and culture, as we are in a time where they are actively trying to wipe that out. I mean, they always have been, but this is an escalation because it's not enough anymore for them to do it to one or two large groups of people. They have to do it to every single person who doesn't look like them, doesn't validate their viewpoint, doesn't care about their culture and the colonizer is strong. There's that story coming out where certain snow related things went and had a meal at a restaurant owned by people who are more indigenous to this land than we are. They're not technically indigenous to this area, but they're more indigenous to North America than we are. And then later went and, you know, raided them. And so, things like that where we're watching, Uranus is about shifts and change, but there's always two sides to a coin, especially with talking about Mercury, especially talking about a Gemini ingress later on. There are people who are going to use this Uranus transit to shift and transform and to create a better world and to unlearn things and to move forward at lightning speed, very much in tune with our eclipses that are coming up. But we're also going to see people who deeply regress, who are fighting to keep the old world, who are willing to burn everything to the ground in order to maintain the extreme privilege that they have. And if they don't have privilege based on other things, they will find a way to gain privilege over others. It's very male has an unpacked thing vibe. Not going to exclude, white women, straight white women especially, but white women in general. So this is a time to really, really look at your beliefs, really look at how you want to move forward with your beliefs in this next 7-year cycle with Uranus, and looking back at what has shifted in the past 7 years with Uranus and Taurus, where that falls in your birth chart. I always say this when we're looking at astrology, but take this and overlay it on your birth chart. Even if you don't know a whole lot about astrology, one of the best ways to get more familiar is to just take charts and start looking at them, knowing from a video like this some basic context and starting to build that knowledge. And I can do my little rundown on aspects. Trines, all in the same element. Squares, all in the same quality, so mutable, cardinal, and fixed. Sextiles, there's one little dude in the middle, and there's two on either side. That's a sextile. I'm dyslexic and I have dyscalculia, so I struggle with math unless I really kind of can sit with it. And I know you're like, it's degrees, Abigail. It's a 360 wheel. Yeah, it still gets screwed up. So I use qualities rather than the angles and to interpret charts. And now I know the angles, but when I was first learning, so that's something to keep in mind as we move forward. And it's very Mercury square Uranus for me to be like, here's some information. Then on Friday, we get Mercury moving into Pisces. This is detriment fall Mercury, double trouble. What I do love about Mercury in Pisces is the pure artistic joy of it. There is no need for clarity. There is no need for being understood or heard. Although it can be frustrating being a native having it when you need to be understood or heard, but as just an idea, Mercury in Pisces is so deeply artistic and wordless and magical. This is a time for art making. I do think we're going to see, especially earlier degrees, we're going to see some really beautiful art coming out, some really beautiful music. And if we're not seeing it now, we're going to see it a few months from now, and maybe even towards the end of the year, where this is the beginning where someone started writing something really, really poignant and beautiful, and hard to express. And over time, because astrology is all about that, it develops into something that wordlessly speaks to others, that connects on a way that is deeper than words and deeper than communication as the norm, which is why I love a Mercury in Pisces. Now, does it make clear communication hard? Absolutely. It is not the best placement for clarity, but it is the best placement for feelings without words, for expressing ourselves through tears, through wordless sounds, through the flow of something. It's a really beautiful artistic moment. I would also encourage you to take some time to connect to forms of art that do not require us to write things down, especially if you're a really cerebral person who does write a lot. Maybe do some practices before you write that allow you to kind of sink into places that don't require words, that allow you to kind of flow through this energy. You might also be getting some blocks because of this, depending on where your Mercury is. Also very important to note, all of the retrogrades, and there's 3 Mercury retrogrades this year, all of those are strictly in water signs. They don't go out of it, out on either side like they do when they're transitioning. Fun fact, Mercury moves in elements with the retrogrades. So the last elements that we had were in fire signs. This now we're going into the water signs and we're getting the full cycle of being completely in water signs. So Pisces season, Cancer season, Scorpio season, all have a Mercury retrograde. I will let you know when we hit the shadow period. I think it's next week actually. Yeah, on the 11th, we hit that Mercury shadow. Yay! So just keep that in mind that that is a Wednesday. So next Wednesday, we will be getting into that energy, keeping in mind that now that we're on the other side of that full moon in Leo, we are also officially into the eclipse portal. For me, the eclipse portal is about 6 weeks, 2 weeks to it, 2 weeks between, 2 weeks on the other side. Now, the zenith of said portal is those 2 weeks between. I find that you don't necessarily experience stuff on the eclipses, but on in that middle section, those 2 weeks, wild times. And I will say, just so you know, as an astrologer, different charts experience time differently. So maybe you feel it more on the lead up, maybe you feel it more on the tail end. But I will say across the board, most people do experience that kind of opening between eclipses, the mouth of the dragon, as you will. And so just bear in mind between the 17th and then 2 weeks between that into our Virgo solar eclipse, just know that that is a testy time. And, what I try to do in these videos is encapsulate the immediate energy because that's really important to work with, but also start to stretch us, me included, so that we can incorporate and understand astrology kind of in a longer scope, so that we can see the solution and the hope in the moment, or the really rough transits, which some of these are, while also seeing that there is stuff coming up in the future and also seeing that there is hope in the future. I had someone tell me replying to me on threads and repeating back to me what I said and saying that they didn't really agree, but this is what they thought, and it was what I had said. And my response was basically not to correct them and be like, that's what I said, but it was to say, I'm really thoughtful about the way that I express things, and I intentionally put some hope into what I was saying, because there is hope. It's just very difficult. And you have to recognize that stuff doesn't change overnight, and it is a privileged belief to think that this will be over, even if wheels started turning that were positive right now. It would not be over for several years, what we are currently experiencing. And there's a reason for that. So just know that there is hope in immediate action. There is hope in the future, but there's also really difficult stuff coming up. The eclipses are going to be hard. Fixed sign eclipses, I find, as someone who has fixed sign placements, are tough. And I don't think that's exclusive to fixed signs. I think it also really is hard on people who don't have a lot of fixed energy to really face the intensity, because that fixed signs are really intense and they don't like to move. And what do the eclipses do? They move everything. It's like having someone coming to your house that's just picking things up, putting stuff in a bag to take away, rearranging your cabinets. It's an intense energy and it can be a lot, especially when it's in a fixed sign and we don't want to change stuff all the time. But then we do have, so back from my little rabbit trail, we do have this Mercury going, Pisces going Mercury. It's going to be there a little extra long. It does station direct on the 20th, which is right before the spring equinox. And it still will be, I think, either right past the station degree or at the station degree when that happens. So the spring equinox does feel a lot better than last year, because if you remember last year, if you were looking at the astrology, we had the Venus retrograde, Mercury retrograde. we had eclipses still on that axis. It was a crazy time. This will be a little better. There is still going to be a bit of a delay with that Mercury retrograde. Excuse me. I do not know what's up. I need maybe dust or something. But I did recently. Who knows? My allergies are up. Anyways, I'm back. That Mercury retrograde is going to kind of leave a bit of, because we're going to be going into the post shadow for 3 weeks. It is going to feel like a bit of a delayed release equinox. And like I said, they're kind of predicting that winter's going to last a little longer this year due to global warming. So just know that's another little pin for the future for y'all. So anyways, we have the Venus square Uranus. This is us now kind of, and this is how Venus and Mercury work. because they generally, excuse me, with the exception of different retrogrades, they are usually pretty close together. Not if one planet retrogrades and the other doesn't, but very often they are close together. And so there is this pattern of kind of call and response where we will experience one aspect, either Venus first or Mercury, depending on what cycle we're going through. And then we will have Venus or Mercury kind of echoing that a few days to weeks later. And so we have that Mercury square Uranus at the station degree. And then on Sunday, we have Venus square Uranus. And so those conversations, those thoughts, those actions, and kind of following through on the thread of things that we experienced earlier in the week, we're coming back in with very real relational consequences. Doesn't mean that the consequences have to be bad. When I use the word consequences, it's just what happens when you do something. It doesn't necessarily mean bad or good. I clarify this because in my own home, consequences were always bad. But this is just like cause and effect. And so, whatever you've done with those relationships, you will start to see by the end of the week the results of that. If you have delayed or haven't had the chance to work through those mercurial things because maybe you're delayed by space and time, that Venus square Uranus is going to bring that back up, and you will once again get to make a choice about how you want to engage in the future. The same thing for a lot of people is also going to, kind of, I think, start or kind of throw us into a journey that is going to continue throughout the year up until the Venus retrograde in Scorpio season. I think it's Scorpio season. I can't remember when it officially starts. I think it starts in October. So I think it might start in Libra season and Scorpio season. But anyways, it's a lot. But we are kind of barreling towards another Venus retrograde. And you're like, Abigail, October, the fall, so far away. Not for astrology, unfortunately. Um, but there is, especially with it retrograding through Scorpio and through Libra, there is a level of anarchy and of shifts and changes. And this is coming from someone who's very deeply monogamous. But I do value and appreciate other people's need for different dynamics and the fact that we do need to break down patriarchal systems. And part of that is experimenting. And so Venus square Uranus is also kind of asking about what you want. As far as progress, maybe something isn't working out for you relationally with someone romantically, and maybe it is less of a question of like, should I be with them, but is this kind of relationship dynamic form, whatever, is this what I want? And it can be either way. It can be you backtracking and being like, no, I want something a little more traditional, or it can be you pushing the bounds and the limits of things to see what works for you. And also for some of us, it might just be a mental exercise of being like, okay, this is the dynamic I've always had in relationships. What would happen if I did it slightly differently? I also do think, especially where Neptune is, and the Saturn conjunction, I do think we're going to see an even bigger, and the way the world is, I think we're going to see a big uptick in divorces. And so I do think Uranus and Gemini is a restructuring of what we consider family system. Some people are going to go back to communal family living as we have in the past. Not for a minute in kind of white America, but or non-immigrant America would be better, because white has changed drastically over time as they move the benchmark. um, you know, and I also think that we're going to start to see, and we've already started to see it, but we're going to see a really big uptick. We'll start to see non-blood related people creating family homes and communal living spaces in order to survive the times that we are currently in. So this is the time to start that. And it might seem, because it's Uranian, it might be like, oh, this is kind of like a crazy idea to like live together with all my divorcee friends or with all of my friends. But it is more possible than you think. We're on the threshold of a really big change where a lot of things that we wouldn't have considered the norm are going to become the norm very quickly, which is why you really have to be keeping an eye on what's going on when it comes to Uranus, because stuff becomes normalized in an instance. And Uranus and Gemini very, very much is related to propaganda. It was during World War II where we saw massive bounds in propaganda and in marketing, which are basically the same thing. And so you can be convinced of something with Uranus and Gemini if you are not keeping your finger on the pulse of Uranus. So just keep that in mind. Anyways, it's we're going to see the breaking and the separating and the rebuilding of relationship dynamics, especially considering that Neptune and Uranus for basically all of 2026 and Saturn included are going to be in a sextile. They're going to be communicating about this. And so really big social changes happening as these folks talk. Similar to where Neptune is going to be and where Pluto is, they are also in a sextile. Am I right about that? Yeah. And that also means that also then, because this is the beautiful thing about astrology, when you have two sextiles and a planet in between, you also have a trine between the planets and the other side of the sextile because they are both in air signs. And so then we also have that trine with Uranus and Pluto. So huge, massive shifts, especially in the next 2 to 3 years when it comes to society, when it comes to normalcy, when it comes to what we think of as family, and when it comes to what we think of as traditional. And you really have to keep up on it in order to make sure that it is the traditional and it is the normalization that you want to participate in and your community wants to participate in. So awareness is not the half the battle, but it's a lot of the battle. So yeah, start to reconsider what you need to survive, what you need to make it with the people that you love. And I'm not talking about survival on an individual level. That is not going to work. You will not make it. As someone who struggles to get community as a disabled person, you will not make it without community. You will not survive. And so this is also about Venus square Uranus, finding a community that you can function in. It also, Venus square Uranus, to me, is also very much learning how to deal with discomfort in relationships. And not discomfort as in like person doesn't believe that you have human rights discomfort. Discomfort is in you're going to have different opinions, especially if you decide to cohabitate with a bunch of people that you're not, like you don't have family traditions with necessarily. This is also an opportunity, and I think it's a really beautiful one over the course of 2020 before I go, because this video is a little longer than normal. This is also the opportunity to view tradition as something that we create, to view ritual as something that we create. You know, you can bring in your own family traditions, but if you are making a life with someone or creating a community, it's really important for you all to have ritual. And that is going to require us, in a very Uranian way, to dissemble what we have and rebuild it into something that works for the majority, which is a very beautiful thing. Not easy. It requires emotional fluency and emotional regulation and connection and care and respect, but it is possible and it is really beautiful. So I encourage you to, this week, especially with the Uranian themes, to really reconsider things that you have thought were fixed. Very Taurus. Reconsider things that you thought are just the way they are, and then reimagine them either as something that you need to dismantle, that's also part of it, but also something that maybe you can deconstruct and recreate into something that meets this moment and meets you where you are. All right, my loves, that's this week. It's a Uranian week. It's shifts and changes and the unexpected. I don't do a lot of mundane astrology, even though I keep up with it and talk with people about it a lot privately. But just know that Uranus energy is surprise, unexpected stuff. This Gemini ingress is orange pants Uranus return. So just keep that in mind. A little bit of hope, because Uranus does create chaos. And Gemini has a sense of humor. And so this week is very much a part of that story, even though we don't really get to see it fully kick in until April. But there's going to be a lot of big revelations. With Mars still adjacent to Pluto and the Sun, we are also going to continue to see secrets being revealed and violence. It hasn't stopped in the G strip, but it has escalated specifically last night when I'm recording this, which is on the day that I'm posting it. Empire is going to escalate things throughout this week using Uranian energy with Pluto revealing secrets, because the faster the secrets are revealed, the quicker the empire crumbles. And so they're going to try to speed stuff up. So we have to meet them with that same Uranian energy of trying to speed things up, of trying to overwhelm people and come up with our own plans and strategies. Because everyone gets to use the astrology. It's very equal. It's an equitable thing, which means even the not so great people and the evil people get to use it too. But we have to meet this Uranian rush to try to keep things the way they are with our own Uranian energy. And if you are a spiritual person or a magical person, I really encourage you to up your ritual, up your protection. I really also encourage all witches to take back baneful magic if you do not use it. We have allowed, and through oppression, our craft to be whitewashed. And a lot of that is treating violence and retaliation and resistance as evil. And no, you should be cursing and hexing people, especially people in power. And that's what I've done last week. So this is your call. If you aren't a witch, become one. If you are one, start cursing people with proper protection, because there's bounce back. You just have to have faith in your craft. Anyways, I will shut off my very hyperactive ADHD brain right now, and I will talk to you later. Please like and subscribe. If you have any questions, pop them in the comments.